All right, so let's jump into this deep dive. We're looking at the Sabbath today. It's been observed for centuries. We've got a really interesting mix of sources to dig into. We've got the Bible, both Exodus and Luke, a modern sermon transcript, oh, and even a study guide to kind of round things out.
It really is amazing how relevant this ancient practice still is today. And we're going to uncover some pretty surprising layers to this whole concept. We're even going to touch on, for instance, how the Jewish tradition starts the day at sunset, which really feeds into the whole philosophy behind Sabbath rest.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's start with like the foundation, the biblical basis for the Sabbath. What's the core idea?
Well, Exodus 20.811 lays it out pretty explicitly. God creates the world in 6 days and then rests on the seventh. It's setting the precedent for us humans to also take a break.
So it's more than just taking a day off. It's like mirroring this divine act of rest.
Exactly. And Exodus goes on to specify what this rest should actually look like. So, verse 10 outlines the restrictions: no work for anyone you, your family, servants, animals, even foreigners who happen to be in town. Just picture it, a bustling ancient town coming to a standstill for the Sabbath.
Whoa, it really makes you think about how different that pace of life must have been compared to our, constantly on world today. But as with any rule, I'm sure there are different interpretations, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting. This plays out in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospel of Luke.
Ah, Luke, always a good source for some drama. What happens there?
Well, in Luke 6.111, we get this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. See, they had a very strict interpretation of what work meant on the Sabbath. And so when Jesus' disciples picked some grain as they were walking through a field and ate it, the Pharisees are outraged. To them, this was considered harvesting, a clear violation of the Sabbath.
So even a seemingly small act like grabbing a snack becomes a point of contention,
Exactly. And this really highlights the clash between these differing views on how to apply these ancient rules to everyday life.
which, I mean, that's something we still struggle with today, right?
Yeah.
Laws and rules are important, but so is context and compassion. I'm really curious to see how Jesus handles this. I have a feeling he's not just going to back down.
Yeah, you're right. He doesn't. He actually pushes back against this rigid interpretation, by reminding them of a story from the Old Testament, King David, right? Driven by hunger, he eats that consecrated bread, which was supposed to be only for priests.
Oh, yeah, that was a pretty bold move.
It was. And Jesus uses this to show that sometimes compassion and human need can outweigh, strictly sticking to the rules. He's really emphasizing the spirit of the law rather than just, the letter of it.
And then he drops that powerful line, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." I mean, that really throws a wrench in the whole debate, doesn't it?
It does. It makes us question who gets to define the meaning and how these ancient traditions are applied. But maybe before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's shift gears a bit and bring in like a more modern perspective.
Yeah.
We have this sermon transcript that offers some interesting insights on this whole idea of rules and how they should be applied.
Okay, so what's the pastor's take?
Well, he argues that rules should guide how we behave, not be used as weapons to judge other people. He warns against falling into that us versus them trap, which the Pharisees might have been guilty of in their conflict with Jesus.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's so easy to get caught up, I think, in proving we're right that we forget about the actual people we're arguing with.
Exactly. And he even tells this really touching story about a guy named Kurt, a Holocaust survivor who faithfully took communion even though he wasn't Christian. Which, I mean, it makes you think, like, how love and grace can sometimes go beyond just blindly following religious rules.
It's a powerful story for sure. Reminds us there's more to these situations than we might realize at first. But going back to the Sabbath as a day of rest, how does this pastor see it?
Well, he focuses on resting in God's love. And this ties in perfectly with the Jewish day, beginning at sunset, which we touched on earlier.
I'm still curious about that. What's the significance of that tradition?
Well, just think about it. According to Jewish tradition, the first thing you do when a new day begins is rest. You're not waking up and jumping right into your to-do list. Instead, you're easing into the day with a sense of peace. It really emphasizes the priority of rest.
Wow. Yeah. That's a beautiful way to look at it. It's like a built-in reminder to put our well-being first right from the start.
Exactly. It ties into the whole idea of the Sabbath as a time to rest, not just physically, but spiritually as well. To rest in knowing that we're loved and worthy, regardless of, what we accomplish.
I'm starting to see how the Sabbath is about so much more than just taking a day off. It's like a whole mindset shift. But let's be real for a minute. Most of us can't just shut down for a whole day every week. We've got jobs, families, all sorts of responsibilities.
Absolutely. And that's where I think the spirit of the Sabbath, becomes more important than just rigidly following the rules. It's not about checking off boxes, but finding ways to regularly connect with what brings us peace and, a sense of meaning.
So instead of focusing on like a literal 24-hour shutdown, maybe it's about finding those pockets of time throughout the week where we can just be.
Exactly. It could be a long walk in nature, spending quality time with your loved ones, doing something creative, or even just sitting in silence and meditating. It's about making a choice to do things that nourish your soul and remind you what really matters.
I love that. It's about making space for the things that restore us both physically and mentally. And I imagine that looks different for everyone.
Absolutely. There's no one right way to experience Sabbath rest. It's a personal journey of figuring out what truly brings you peace. But, this tension between the traditional idea of Sabbath and our modern busy lives, it really brings up an interesting question.
What's that? Well, how do we reconcile, this ancient practice of Sabbath rest with like the demands of the modern world? I mean, the world's changed a lot since the time of the Bible.
It has. And that's where I think, we have to be careful not to get too stuck in a purely historical interpretation, right? The Sabbath at its core was meant to be a gift, a time for rejuvenation, connection. But sometimes, even the best intentions can get kind of lost in translation over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me of the Pharisees we were talking about, right? So
Hmm.
focused on the letter of the law, that they kind of missed the whole point of compassion and understanding that Jesus was showing.
Yeah, it's a good reminder for all of us that rules, no matter how well-intentioned, can sometimes become barriers to the very things they were meant to protect.
So how do we find that balance? How do we honor the spirit of the Sabbath without, getting bogged down in these legalistic interpretations that might not apply to our lives today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It really does require a delicate balance. We
Mhm.
need to honor, the wisdom of this ancient tradition while also recognizing that our world has evolved in ways that, they couldn't have imagined back then.
Sounds like it's less about finding the quote unquote right answers and more about like having this ongoing conversation with ourselves and our communities about what Sabbath rest means in our own lives.
You said it perfectly. It's about being mindful, intentional, and compassionate, in how we approach this ancient practice. As we've been talking, it's really struck me how this idea of the Sabbath is kind of woven into the very fabric of creation itself.
Now that you mention it, yeah, it is, isn't it? It's not just some random rule. It's reflected in like the natural rhythms of the universe.
Exactly, from the cycle of day and night to the changing seasons, Life just has this natural ebb and flow that's like calling us to embrace both activity and rest.
That's a great point. And that's something we can all learn from, no matter what our beliefs are. It's about recognizing that we're not machines meant to just go nonstop. We're human beings who need time to recharge and reconnect with ourselves and the world around us.
And maybe this idea of Sabbath rest doesn't have to be limited to just one specific day or, time period. What if we found ways to like weave moments of peace and renewal into our everyday lives?
Oh, I love that. It's like sprinkling little Sabbath moments throughout the week, like little oases of calm in the middle of all the chaos.
Exactly. And those moments, no matter how small, they can really make a difference.
So maybe the challenge isn't about finding a whole day for rest, but about cultivating like a Sabbath state of mind, a way of being that prioritizes peace, presence, connection, no matter what we're doing.
That's beautifully put, and it's definitely a challenge worth embracing.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question. If the Sabbath is about resting in that deeper sense of peace and connection, how can each of us find those personal Sabbath moments throughout our week?
It's a great question to think about. It could be something as simple as taking 5 minutes each morning just to breathe and appreciate the sunrise. Or maybe it's turning off your phone for an hour in the evening to really connect with your family. There's no right or wrong answer. It's about finding those practices that help you, reconnect with your inner peace, a sense of purpose, the things that truly matter to you.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. Be open to exploring different ways to integrate these moments of rest and renewal into your life. See what works. Until next time, happy resting, everyone.